I'm working on yet another of the road cases that I build for the museum that I volunteer with. And one of the parts of doing this that I really hate, it's not the woodwork, it's the painting. I have a very small space to do this in, and especially with the larger cases, I can't have them up on a table or something, and it's hard to use a can of spray paint when these large objects are sitting down on the floor or just barely above the floor on a couple of chunks of scrap wood. I've meant for many cases to finally get around to building a set of risers to get these cases up a little higher, so at least when I'm painting along the bottom edges, the paint cans can still be vertical and shooting straight at the object instead of shooting down at it at an angle. So I finally decided to get cracking with this. From the same case that I'm building here, I had cut down some select pine boards that were, I believe, 2 inches by 2 inches, and the parts I cut off ended up just being about 1/8 of an inch thick, but the full, 8 feet long. And I had 3 boards that I cut down, so one set of 3 thin strips are a little wider than the ones where I then turn the wood and cut another side off. So the ones that are a little wider on the left in this picture and the ones that are slightly narrower are on the right. But I decided that I was going to use only these scraps and some cut off pieces of Masonite from the same case to build these 2 risers. As usual, I figure out the design on a piece of paper, get all the dimensions figured out, and in this instance I didn't have a specific size for the risers. I wanted them to be about 1 foot tall, just again to be able to hold a can of spray paint with its bottom just above the floor and still have it shooting straight ahead when I'm painting along the bottom of the cases that are sitting on the risers. So I figured 11, 12 inches would be a good height, and I still had to make them small enough that I could build them structurally out of the slips of wood available. And then the X and Y dimensions of the top were dictated by 2 scraps of Masonite that I had laying around. I forget the exact dimensions, but it was something like 8.5 inches by 11 inches or something like that. It's probably shown on this sketch, but I can't read it as I'm editing the video. I used my miter saw to chop up those thin slats into all these pieces you see stacked in this photo, and then the 2 Masonite panels are sitting behind them on top of the table saw. The set on the left are the wider pieces that will go vertically, and the set in the middle are the narrower pieces that'll go vertically. The wider ones are for the corners. And then the 2 sets on the right, long and short each, are the pieces for the top and bottom frames of the risers. Here I'm just doing a test fit of the short and long pieces for the top frames, comparing them to the size of the Masonite panel. And you can see in this view how I'm just abutting the short sides against the ends of the long sides. Here I have marked the top and bottom pieces for one of the sides, and I've laid out 2 wide slats for the corners and 3 narrower slats for the interstitials. And then here is a view of them glued together with wood glue. And finally, here's a view with a piece of Masonite laying over the top and a bit of a weight on top to act as a clamping force while the wood glue dries. Notice how I've got this set up against the fence on my table saw, and then a square is off the fence so I can align the bottom edge to make sure that I build this whole assembly nice and square. Here I'm gluing up the second panel while the first one dries. I basically let each panel dry for about 30 minutes. At that point it's solid enough to no longer have to clamp it, and I can push it aside for further drying while I do the next one. So it only takes a couple hours to glue up all 4 wide sides for the 2 risers, and then I can move on to the narrow sides. Here I'm fitting up one of the narrower sides. This one only has 3 narrow slats in the middle, and the slats on the ends are arranged a little differently because of the way I want them to interleave or interlock with the outer slats on the wider sides. Here is that narrower side with the Masonite and a weight on top. I got impatient with the 4 narrower sides and just decided to use another scrap of Masonite and the Masonite back of a clipboard and various other weights, tanks of gas and so on, so I could just glue up all 4 of the narrower side panels at the same time. Here's a stack of completed wide sides while the narrow ones are drying off to the right. And here are the 4 narrow sides dried and ready to use. Here's the first assembly. I have temporarily taped up 2 narrow sides and 2 wide sides resting on one of the Masonite panels to make sure everything fits, that the sides interlock as I designed. And here's the sides laid out, ready for me to apply glue to them and then fold them up from their positions that are laid down up to vertical. And then here's where they are glued, and now I've taped the corners just to hold them together while the glue dries. And here's another view of that. You can see a lot of the wet glue in the corners. And here's the other one glued and taped. And here's another view of the same thing. After the glue has set just enough that it's not going to run much anymore, I flip them over and let them dry overnight in this position. I've pulled off the masking tape at this point so the glue under it can dry without actually getting itself glued to the tape. Then here's the next day with all the glue fully dried, one riser upside down, the other one right side up. And here is the case I'm working on, resting for the first time on its 2 risers, Masonite sides up. That is so that there's a nice, flat, smooth surface for the objects to rest on, rather than having them rest on the sharp, uneven edges of the bottom of these risers. And here's a final view, and you can visualize how having the case up about 11 inches will be, I think it actually turned out to be about 11.5 inches tall. That'll be plenty to help a lot with the subsequent painting on this case. And it didn't take me long at all, you know, basically 2.5 hours to design and cut the pieces, and then really just a few hours to glue everything up, and then overnight, and then done. You may ask why I didn't just use some more scraps of wood to make the sides solid instead of bothering cutting pieces and gluing them up. And there's really a couple reasons for that. One is I didn't have any other panels of the right sizes. I'd have to cut up a sheet to get them. I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to make this all out of scrap. Secondly, it gave me a use for all those cut off thin strips that I'd otherwise have to break up into pieces and throw in the trash. And third, having the open sides like that allows me to grab them and reposition them a little more easily as required before, during, after painting, whereas flat sides would be a lot harder to grip and manipulate. And did I mention that it also makes them a lot lighter weight?